Welcome to DIYeasycrafts and BergKnifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at the final step in the knife making process, the assembly and sheath making for this heart-themed knife. Now this knife was designed and built for a cancer auction donation. The handles, which I covered on a separate video, are cast with little paper cutouts. The blade itself has an etching on it, electro-etched. I covered that on a separate video. So this video, we're going to do the assembly. We're going to attach the handle to the blade and shape it and polish it. And then, in addition, my friend Tommy Berg from down in Florida made this beautiful sheath to complement the blade. And I'm going to show you an overview on how he made that sheath. So I start by forming the front edge of the handles. I clamp both sides together. I've already glued them onto a white liner. And I'm just going to grind them to shape with about a 60 grit belt. You don't want to go too coarse here because you have to polish out all those lines. I then changed belts and went to an 80, a 120, a 240, and I think a 600 was the final. Then over to the buffing wheel. And anytime you're using this cast epoxy resin, you really want to sand down to somewhere in the 1,000, 1,500 range before you polish, and then you can get that real shine. And there's no way you could polish that forward edge after it's attached to the blade. Now, I attach my blade to the handle with the Northgard technique. I glue and clamp one side at a time, and I let that dry before I go on to the next side. Because I shaped both sides of the handles together, both the sides are ground square to each other, and the forward edge is uniform with each other. It's very easy for me to line up that second side. So here I cleaned up any of the epoxy that's squeezed out just with a paper towel and then an alcohol wipe. After it's dry, I go to my drill press. Note that I have a backing board underneath, and I also have a clamp in place to prevent that blade from catching and spinning on me. The backing board prevents any blowout. So I drilled through the holes that were pre-drilled in the knife handle as my drill guide. So now I have pinholes drilled through one side of the handle as well as the blank itself. I'm going to just repeat the process now. I can line up both sides, I can line up the front, and then I clamp that into position. And I really just want to be very careful and confirm that front edge is lined up exactly where I want it to be, so that both sides match. Then again, I clean off any epoxy that's squeezed out during the clamping process. I use a paper towel and a plastic knife for this, and then I go back with a little alcohol wipe. And I also, at this time, wipe down the entire blade. I just want to make sure that I didn't have any remnants of glue on my fingers and get it on the blade at all. I also glued the pins in place. Now after that dried, I want to grind those pins flat. I use a coarse grit belt for this. I use a 60. I used 24s in the past, but the grooves, the cut lines are so deep they're hard to get rid of during the polishing phase. Even with the 60, and you want to use a coarse grit because it generates less heat. I cool frequently. So I grind for a couple seconds and then right into the bucket to cool. Once I get both sides flat, then I can finish profiling the handles or removing all the excess material from the handles. Now one of the tricks that I use is I water jet my blanks so that they all have a consistent shape. So I can use an existing or extra blank as my guide for the handle. I can line up the pins, and I can just use a black magic marker or a Sharpie to outline the handle. If you don't, you can always just make a template of your handle before you glue it up. In either case, that gives me a visual reference, and I can then very quickly cut away any excess material with a bandsaw. And I don't have to be super accurate here. I don't want to cut into the metal, of course. I'm really just trying to get rid of as much of that extra handle material as possible. Now I go over to the belt sander, the 2x72 with a 90-degree table on it. Again, sticking with about that 60 grit belt, and I can finish profiling the handles. I will grind now until I just start to hear the metal. So I'm in contact with the metal, and I remove the majority of the remaining extra handle material. I can even get into those inside curves by letting that 2-inch belt overhang the right side of the flat platen. It allows it to just then kind of go with the flow and the curve of the material. Now next I'm going to actually start to round over that 90-degree edge on the top of the handle. I do this right on the flat platen. Other people use other methods. Just be very careful. At this point, the knife is almost finished, and it's very quickly can be damaged. If you touch the blade to that grinder, you can ruin a knife in a heartbeat. But if you're real careful, I do this with a 80 grit belt. I just round it over. I get a nice feel for it. And then I can actually start to shape the inside edge with the 2-inch contact wheel at the bottom of the flat platen. Again, very careful, never to touch the belt to the blade, but you can really remove a lot of material very quickly. And you can just rough shape the handles. I use a small wheel attachment to smooth out any of the horizontal grind lines, from the 90-degree table, especially in that little curve. Small wheel attachment, comes in very handy. And then I go over to an oscillating sander. I just find it's very quick. I'm able to run through a variety of different grits. Again, with the epoxy or resin handles, I usually start, at probably 220, 400, 600, 1,000, and 2,000. And each time I take one of those discs off, I'll do a little hand sanding with it. And a lot of times, I'll get this entire handle completely polished, and then I'll go back 1 or 2 grits, resand, and repolish again, just to get rid of any remaining little scratches or little marks that I didn't catch the first time. And it sounds like a lot, but it's really not. The first 220 that you use, you're removing a lot of material. The rest of it, it's really just polishing, so it doesn't take long. And then the final step is going to be going over to the buffing wheel with a little compound. You want to have a very light touch. You want to let the buffing compound do the work of polishing, and that finishes off the blade as well as polishes those stainless pins relatively quickly. The next step is going to be sharpening the knife. So I establish the micro bevel with a 120 grit belt, holding the blade at approximately 20 degrees, and I grind both sides until I establish a bevel, I establish a burr along the entire edge of the blade. Once that burr is created, then I'm going to change the belts. I'm going to run through belts all the way down to 2,000 grit. And every pass, I'm going to establish that burr along the entire edge. Again, it sounds like a long process, but it's really not. The first, establishing the micro bevel, takes a little while, but every other belt, you're slowing down the machine, and you're really just polishing that bevel. So I get it down to 2,000 grit. I've got a burr that you can just barely catch on your fingernail along the entire length. And then the final step in the sharpening process is to use a leather stropping belt. Now, some people use this under power. I just use the machine to kind of hold the belt, and I just stroke by hand. That's 1 or 2 passes on each side, and the blades are literally razor sharp. So that basically finishes off the knife. Now let's take a look at how Tommy made a heart-themed sheath to go along with this knife. Now he starts with three pieces which he cut out of leather. You've got the top piece, the bottom piece, as well as the welt, which is cut out and goes kind of in between, gets glued and eventually sewn in place, and that prevents the sharp blade from cutting the threads. It gives that little space in between the two pieces of leather for the blade to actually fit. Now he started out, he just used a paper template of some hearts, and he drew them on with a pencil as a guide. And you can also see he's got his location or his guidelines on there for where he's going to sew the pieces together. And he uses a cutting tool to kind of cut into or cut the outline of each heart. And you can see, like, as with the knife making process, any of these hand made crafts, they take a lot of time and a lot of skill. So he's going to outline each heart. A little bit of pressure. He's certainly not cutting all the way through. He's just cutting down, to almost a preset depth. And then during the next process, he'll use a little stamping tool to press down the background. So now you can see that he started to stamp or press down that background with a little stamping tool. And that even highlights the hearts a little bit more. Now, if Tommy makes the majority of my sheaths. If anybody's interested, he makes some great sheaths. He's located down in Florida. I put his email right up on this video. I highly recommend him. So now what he's doing is he's using a little bit of leather dye or stain and a very fine paintbrush to fill in that background color so it's a little bit darker. Then he'll stain the entire sheath. And of course, when it's sewn all together, you got your belt loop on the back, you've got a lockdown strap coming over the front, and he ended up making a beautiful heart-themed leather sheath. So this is the finished product. You've got a sheath that's highly detailed on both sides. It follows that same heart theme as the blade does, and as does the handle. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'd like to give you an invite to join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. You can certainly post images of your own creations on there. And if you're interested in making your own knives, check out the book that Jason Northgard and I put out about 2 years ago called Introduction to Knife Making, and that can be found on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.